Hey everyone, welcome back to another hardware news recap for the week. This one, a really busy week leading into the end of the year with a lot of kind of fun news items. For example, Intel is bringing out its new Haswell Pentium CPU. Yes, really, we'll be talking about Intel's new 22 nanometer CPU. New in big air quotes there. Xbox got an announcement of sorts with the Xbox Series X naming being dropped, sacrificing the old Project Scarlet naming, and also a look that resembles the Corsair One. We'll also be talking about Intel losing a lot of grasp on the market. Its days of 90% market share seem to be over, as admitted by the company itself. There's a new Plundervolt attack that leverages Intel's overclocking features to exploit security vulnerabilities. That's of interest as well. Speaking of security vulnerabilities, Ring cameras facing further scrutiny for repeated vulnerabilities for consumers, and then maybe some brief coverage of AMD's Radeon Adrenalin 2020 edition. Before that, this video is brought to you by EVGA's RTX 2080 Ti XE Ultra. The 2080 Ti XE Ultra is what we use in our CPU reviews to avoid GPU bottlenecks. The XE Ultra uses hydraulic dynamic bearing fans for reduced noise, features RTX support for DXR titles, and uses a massive 2.75 slot cooler. The cooler design allows the fans to spin slower and quieter while sinking heat, further leveraging a mix of L-shaped and traditional fins to maximize airflow or contact. Learn more at the link in the description below. So for the first news item, I wanted to update you all on our November campaign we did, where we did a charity drive for Eden reforestation projects, which reforests deforested parts of the world. And we wanted to help by providing some funding, working with our viewers to replant some of those trees in deforested regions. So we announced this in early November and ran it through November. The heart of it was that we had a donation match set up on edenprojects.org/GamersNexus. That site should still be there if you wanted to donate anyway, but the match is over now. So we had a match set up for $1,500. We also had a contribution of 10 trees planted per item sold on the GamersNexus store through November, and some orders had enough items in them to plant 50 trees or more, by the way, which is great. And then we also had a couple of standout viewers and notables contributing their own donations to the campaign. So the end of this is we worked together, all of us in the community, to drive a total of $8,961 to the Eden Reforestation projects, which is phenomenal. That's amazing, really. The charity here has extremely low overhead, so that works out to almost 90,000 trees planted for the duration of that charity drive, which again is incredible numbers because of their really low overhead and the community effort. So this, I wanted to call out a couple of notables. We had one donor that did $2,000 on their own. I don't know who it is. I probably could have asked Eden Projects who it was, but it would put them in a bit of a weird place. For privacy reasons, I didn't ask. But if you wanted to tell me, you're welcome to. There was a donation from Nick Light from LMG, from Linus Tech Tips, actually. I think his was $250, which is great. We had Max Eliezer, or Max to the Max, on the GN Patreon Discord, who matched our match. So match to the match, $1,500 from him as well. And then we also had a contribution from one Mr. Leo from Kit Guru as well, and there are a few others in there too. I'm sorry if I didn't name you. But the community itself raised thousands, which is great, and the attrition rate is also really low on these trees. So Eden typically sees natural regeneration take over within a couple of years when they plant trees, which means you have some attrition, of course, when you plant a bunch of things, some will die off. But that rate is low enough that within a couple of years, the forest's ability to regenerate itself exceeds the attrition rate, so it ends up being a positive direction of growth, which means that maintenance can go down with time, although Eden does employ people to take care of and protect the forest as it's planted, all that stuff. Anyway, we've talked about all this before and how it works. All native species, it's diversified, so that one disease can't wipe out the whole forest. All that stuff's good. But we got a statement from Eden Reforestation Projects as well to share with you all, and they said, quote, "Thanks to GamersNexus and their supporters, the GamersNexus campaign raised $8,961. That will help alleviate people in extreme poverty and plant 89,610 trees around the world in Haiti, Indonesia, Kenya, Nepal, Madagascar, and Mozambique. GamersNexus, their viewers and supporters, truly showed what a community can accomplish when they join together to support a cause to change the world. Eden Reforestation Projects team would like to thank everyone at GamersNexus, their viewers and supporters, for your compassionate support. Your generosity makes our mission possible. So thanks again to everyone for contributing to the campaign. This is one we really care about. And as another note of positivity, we're actively working on putting together another event. This one's going to be a charity auction coming up, and it's going to be for a no-kill cat shelter, actually. A lot of you like Snowflake's appearances in the videos. I thought that's a good fit. We'll get Snowflake to pose in some photos for some of the products we're going to auction off, and then everyone's happy, and then we'll contribute all of the money from those auctions to a cat shelter. But more on that later. Anyway, that one will be, we've got a lot of stuff that we need to clear out, like perfectly functional video cards, iconic things we've reviewed, and even the mod mat, the two of them right now that I have on this very table that have been, one of these has been in use for a little over a year. So we're gonna auction the mod mats off from the live stream table and the set table and autograph them, stuff like that. Anyway, keep an eye out for that in the next week or so. Next up, a new Xbox image was posted by Microsoft this week, some renders and a bit of an announcement. The console's name was one of the main ones being revealed as the Xbox Series X, because more X's, is it X's or Xen? More Xen means more better for gamers, as we all know. That's why the XFX RX 5700 XT thick is such a good seller. That's why it was on sale for a lot less than MSRP. Anyway, X's make things good, and The Verge, famous for, well, The Verge had a headline posted that said, quote, "The Xbox Series X is basically a PC, and that's why you'll want one, because we can't build one." I added that last part. But anyway, that's the general take by media has been it's basically a PC, which, okay, whatever. They're all basically a PC. But anyway, the Xbox Series X looks an awful lot like the Corsair One. It's got that chimney approach to design. It's a tall chassis. The exhaust is presumably at the top. And the renders don't really show much. They don't show like the back panel of it anyway, but we'd have to assume that intake is probably at the bottom. That'd make the most sense. There might be intake in the back side or something. If it's at the bottom, we'd mostly be concerned that these things are often on carpet and there's maybe a couple millimeters of space at the bottom of the render for it to breathe through, which is not sufficient for adequate cooling of really anything over a long period of usage by consumers in a normal environment where it's probably not maintained. So we'd like to see more than 1 inch or about 1 inch of space at the bottom, but from a render we can't really tell exactly what's going on, so we'll buy one when it comes out and test it ourselves and let you know how the thermals are. Anyway, the Xbox Series X is noted as having, quote, 4 times the processing power of the Xbox One X, whatever that means. You can measure processing power in a whole lot of ways. It's also stated as being, quote, quiet and efficient, and Microsoft noted that 1 fan is present in the entire system. Early reports were indicating that the Series X is, quote, as wide as an Xbox One controller, which we think is probably part of the metric system that they use in Europe, but we're not sure how many Xbox controllers wide something is. Maybe it's used more over there. But anyway, we converted Xbox One controller width into furlongs, and it's about 0.0008 furlongs long. It's roughly 0.34 cubits or so if you use that instead. If that's not helpful, we also measured it in normal people numbers and found it to be about 15.5 centimeters for an Xbox One controller. So if that's the sizing of the new chassis, assuming the renders are to be believed, then you're looking at potentially a 140 mil fan in there, unless they go for a 120 due to other internal space restrictions that we can't see from an outside shot. And the console will still support discs, probably for the best for most of the world. The internet's still not really fast enough, and including the US, of course. And it's also advertised as being able to handle, quote, 4K at 60 FPS. Whatever. Probably what's really going to happen is a lot of games will continue to push the graphics to a point where they have to run at 4K 30, but we'll test it once it's out. And it's also supposed to be able to handle, quote, handle up to 120 FPS, which again, we'll see. Technically, the current console could probably handle 120 FPS if you played something like Pac-Man on it. So there was also a leak a few weeks ago. I wanted to bring this up. This isn't news now, but the PlayStation 5 had a leak, and we've seen a lot of comments asking about it. And you've probably seen the images of this one because the console looks quite ugly, I think, is the general takeaway for this. So that's a dev kit. And while we're not certain what the consumer product will look like, just to offer some insight here, Developers will often deal with a lot of these consoles at once while doing QA and testing, and the big development houses may end up stacking them. So we think that the reason for these dev kits being sort of V-shaped on the PlayStation 5 with the interior being obviously ventilation and the top front of it having notches for the feet, which align with the feet on the bottom of the console, would be so that you could stack them so that they could all still breathe centrally rather than potentially restricting the bottom intake or top exhaust or whatever it may be for standard consoles. So I wanted to point that out. We would doubt the consumer version will look quite like that. It's possible, but it's probably for functionality first, and then we'll see what happens later. Next up, this one's pretty fun. Intel is resurrecting Haswell-era Pentiums to sate its shortages. In a somewhat baffling move, Intel recently issued a product change notification, or PCN as they call them, indicating that it was resurrecting Haswell-era Pentium CPUs of the G3420 series. The G3420 initially launched in 2013 and was manufactured on Intel's 22 nanometer process node. The G3420 was discontinued in 2015, but now it's looking to see a short period of revival. Despite a vaguely worded PCN, the only real reason for Intel to bring back such a chip is an attempt to curtail its shortages, sating customers who don't need higher-end compute products or just good products in general. In theory, Intel shouldn't have much issue producing 22 nanometer silicon. It's 14 nanometer and beyond that's had the company in the throes of shortages for some 18 months now. In accordance with the PCN, customers can expect supply of the G3420 through May 26th, 2020, with last orders being shipped December 20th, 2020, and you will still need the older motherboards, the ones that were made for that CPU in order to use it. So hopefully there's no shortage of those if you're buying one, but also this is not something that consumers should really be. Anyone in our audience, if you're spending $50, it should probably be on a 3000G or something, not on a CPU that is this old. 2013 is pretty damn old. Next up, an ARM-powered workstation with Ampere's eMAG CPU in the news. Some time ago, we reported on an interesting chip startup known as Ampere Computing being headed by former Intel president Renee James. Ampere set out to focus on ARM-based silicon for servers, recognizing the potential advantage that ARM-based chips could leverage over x86 chips. However, that doesn't seem to have stopped Ampere Computing from getting its eMAG CPUs into workstations. Ampere's eMAG 8180, a 32-core chip built on TSMC's 16-nanometer FinFET node, is now being offered in the Ampere eMAG 64-bit ARM workstation from Advantech. The Ampere eMAG workstation comes as a single-socket workstation with up to 512 gigabytes of DDR4 2666 and can be ordered with a variation of NVMe and SATA storage. Additionally, the workstation can be configured with one of three GPUs, the AMD FirePro W2100 2GB card, a Radeon Pro WX 5100 8GB option, or the NVIDIA Quadro GV100 32GB. Linux is the only OS on tap here, with a few different distros being offered. Those include Ubuntu, CentOS, Linux SUSE, or OpenSUSE. Intel's days of 90% dominance looking to come to an end. We recently published our own report on DIY enthusiast purchases in the GamersNexus audience, which is a small subset of the market. But in that one, we were seeing upwards of 93% AMD sales month to month versus Intel's 7% sustained sales volume, which is not looking great. But that's one small space of a much larger market. And while presenting at an annual technology conference, I think it was Credit Suisse, Intel CEO Bob Swan offered a sobering view of the company's position in the market and its intentions for the future. The internal mindset at Intel looks like they're trying to foster that Intel continues to diversify and settle into a data-centric era with less focus on keeping that 90% plus market share that it's grown so accustomed to holding in the overall computing segment. There was some spin involved here, but maybe some reality as well, where Swan resigned to saying that they're thinking about having 30% share in a larger total addressable market, or TAM, for silicon in the future. And they're citing that as, quote, "We think about having 30% share in a $230 billion silicon TAM that we think is going to grow to $300 billion silicon TAM over the next 4 years. And Swan said, frankly, I'm trying to destroy the thinking about having 90% share inside our company because I think it limits our thinking. I think we will miss technology transitions. We miss opportunities because we're in some ways preoccupied with protecting 90 instead of seeing a much bigger market with much more innovation going on, both inside our four walls and outside our four walls. Intel's looking at diversifying into other parts of the silicon market outside of, well, computing, where it is primarily now. As a note, Intel's sort of tried this in the past, and it's been mostly forced out in mobile, for example, portables and mobile. Laptops, it's done okay, but once you get down to handheld devices like phones, Intel's not done so well. They've been forced out of that. So this isn't something new for Intel to try, but overall, although Intel has said things like this before, it comes from a much more candid perspective this time from the CEO. And this also comes at a time when Intel has been forced to be as competitive as ever. So in some respects, it looks like a bit of throwing in the towel, or at least tweaking the game so that Intel can continue to look to its investors as if it's going to be able to compete in the market going forward. So this harkens back a bit to the Athlon 64 days. Intel's also in an interesting position because relating to its manufacturing, both in terms of ability to produce and deliver, Intel has been struggling. It's been ensnared by the 14 nanometer CPU, 14 nanometer shortages for silicon. And hence the earlier story about 22 nanometer continuing to come back, even though it should be firmly dead at this point. So Intel has firmly ceded its process node lead to TSMC. That's known at this point. Although Intel's 10 nanometer might be equivalent to TSMC's 7 nanometer for AMD, it doesn't matter if 10 nanometer is not really shipping. So it puts them in a tough place. Swan's comments seem to suggest Intel is willing to surrender market share to AMD voluntarily or otherwise, as long as it fits into Intel's long-term look of gaining a 30% total share in the wider semiconductor market. Speaking of Intel's 10 nanometer purportedly matching 7 nanometer elsewhere, more interesting news that came out of the same conference was that Intel expects its 7 nanometer process to match TSMC's 5 nanometer process. Additionally, Intel expects that its 5 nanometer process will be on par with TSMC's 3 nanometer process. They're basically saying that they're one step ahead in density and elsewhere. On top of Intel effectively conceding process defeat to TSMC, what's more crucial is that Intel's 7 nanometer process isn't slated to arrive until 2021, while TSMC's 5 nanometer node is expected to ramp and produce chips in the second half of 2020. As Tom's Hardware points out, when Intel moved to a 22 nanometer FinFET process, it signaled the beginning of Intel's process leadership reign. Not only were other fabs still on a larger process node, Intel's process also featured an aggressive transistor density that no one could match. Ultimately, this is what led to Intel's current troubles, and even caused problems early on when Intel moved down to 14 nanometer with Broadwell. It's a bit of an Intel news show this week, but we've had a lot of AMD news shows lately as well, so although these are a lot more negative. As evidenced by the Plundervolt attack that we need to talk about next. So for this one, there's a new Plundervolt, it's called, attack that leverages some of the voltage and frequency features of Intel's processors. In continuing the Intel coverage, we arrive at the latest in a string of security vulnerabilities for Intel's chips, as if Intel needed yet another arena in which to compete against AMD unfavorably at the moment. The security battle is turning out to be very lopsided. The newest attack is aptly titled Plundervolt, as it effectively plunders otherwise secure data from what's supposed to be the most secure area on Intel chips by manipulating CPU voltage parameters. While we'll leave the technical breakdown to ZDNet, who already have a thorough analysis of the attack and attack surface, Plundervolt alters voltage and frequency states to extract data from the SGX enclave. Plundervolt has also proven to operate more quickly at obtaining protected data than that of other side channel attacks like Spectre or Meltdown. Intel's SGX enclaves exist in CPU memory, and they're meant to be secure sections of the CPU where applications can be isolated for security purposes. Plundervolt leverages existing attack principles from the previously disclosed row hammer and clock screw attacks, where it can manipulate data within those isolated SGX enclaves to breach the security that's meant to be afforded to them. So when the data comes out the other end of it, it can be decrypted easily. Researchers told ZDNet that Plundervolt can't be executed via JavaScript on a website, so that's an upside, and that it must instead be executed from localized applications with elevated permissions. Local access to the machine isn't required, but it's not a web attack either. So Plundervolt also can't work in virtual machines, which is at least one positive side. As far as Intel's issued microcode updates and fixes via the Intel SA-00289, if you want to look into more of that. And then last couple here, Ring cameras facing their own security vulnerabilities. This is why we don't run ads for Ring. We've actually had the opportunity to do so in the past, but we don't. Personally, I don't really like internet-attached security devices or Internet of Things devices. I don't think my fridge needs a brain. But a new story published by the Washington Post talks about another victim in a string of Ring camera hacks. A family recently purchased Ring cameras to keep an eye on their baby and young child. And although this all started innocently enough with the intent of the mother being able to talk to the children while working late night, the end result was unfortunately the family regretting the purchase after an unidentified intruder was able to gain access to the devices. In a video obtained by the Post, the intruder played, actually it's quite creepy the whole thing, but played Tiptoe Through the Tulips, which apparently is known for its usage in a horror film, to get the 8-year-old to respond to the room, began talking to the child through the camera, and moving on past all of that stuff, you can read the full write-up in the Post if you want, but the use case in this instance was one that originally had good intentions of monitoring the children remotely while working late nights, but the vulnerabilities the vulnerabilities prove exceptionally dangerous in this point and could have long-term mental or emotional impact for anyone affected by this. So, in talking with Amazon-owned Ring, the affected couple reported that Amazon's Ring device should have had two-factor authentication enabled, effectively victim blaming. And sadly, some of the top comments on this article in particular too were also victim blaming, saying that you either should have had a better password or two-factor authentication, or you shouldn't have bought it at all. So there's not really a great answer to this, but there are legitimate use cases for devices like this. That said, we don't really like internet-attached cameras for security purposes, and I would, of course, recommend that our audience do a whole lot of research before investing in any of them. And then the last one, AMD's Radeon Adrenalin 2020 edition. AMD had a big driver update just before Christmas. Has a lot of bugs. The fan profiling is absolute garbage. It doesn't work most of the time, and also the overclocking is mostly broken. So that's it for your recap for the week. We're really frustrated with AMD's drivers. You'll hear more about why in an upcoming video. But check back, subscribe for more. Go to store.gamersnexus.net to help us out directly, or patreon.com/gamersnexus. We'll see you all next time.